Your calm is not your absence of emotion. It's your refusal to be controlled by it. You wake up, check your phone, and one message from your business partner hits you before coffee. We need to talk about yesterday's numbers. Just 6 words. But your heart is already racing, your jaw tightens, and the peaceful morning you imagined evaporates. You snap at your wife over breakfast because she asks a simple question about weekend plans. You cancel the strategy meeting you needed to lead because you don't have the headspace. By noon, you've made 3 decisions based on anxiety, not strategy. By evening, you barely recognize the man in the mirror, tense, irritable, exhausted by his own reactions. That's not just a bad morning. That's your life being run by triggers. And if you don't stop it, this pattern will cost you more than a few peaceful mornings. It will cost you respect, both from others and from yourself. It will cost you opportunities you worked decades to earn. It will cost you the very relationships that make your success meaningful. You'll say things you don't mean to people who matter most. You'll make decisions from panic that take years to undo. You'll watch your hard-built empire wobble because the man at the top can't control his internal weather. But here's what changes everything. When you build unshakable calm, you stop bleeding energy and start leading. You protect your peace like the precious resource it is. You command respect not through loudness, but through unwavering presence. You choose your battles with the wisdom of a general, not the desperation of a cornered soldier. You become the man who stays clear when everyone else is scrambling. The man whose word carries weight because it's never spoken in haste. The man who can handle any crisis without becoming the crisis himself. This is not about suppressing what you feel. It's about mastering what you do with it. It's about learning that you can feel the storm inside and still choose your next move with clarity. That you can be triggered and not become reactive. That you can have everything on the line and still keep your head. How to stop anything from hijacking your emotions and finally own your days with power. That's what this book will give you today, not tomorrow, not when life calms down, but today. Chapter 1. Feel the impulse before it leads you. There is a moment that appears before any reaction becomes real, though most people pass through it too quickly to notice. It is the small pause between the trigger and the response. The brief tightening in the chest, the slight change in breath, the instinctive need to answer immediately, as if silence itself were a threat. This moment arrives faster than thought, faster than intention, and often faster than awareness. Yet it is precisely here, in this narrow space, where emotional control is built or lost. Impulse always enters the scene with urgency. It convinces the mind that a quick reaction is necessary, that a message must be answered now, that a tone must be corrected instantly, that a point must be made before it slips away. The body prepares for this speed long before the mind questions whether movement is even required. And because the beginnings of emotion often feel like truth, people treat the first internal surge as a command rather than as a piece of information. The body reacts first because it is built to protect. A sharp comment, an unexpected message, a perceived challenge. All of these signal potential threat long before reason has time to understand the situation. Shoulders stiffen, the jaw tightens, the heartbeat accelerates. These sensations are not decisions. They are alerts. But without awareness, alerts turn into actions, and temporary emotions shape choices that last far longer than the feelings that created them. Marcus, a 52-year-old executive, had gone through most of his life without distinguishing between impulse and intention. One evening, a short message from his son landed with a tone that felt careless and disrespectful. Before he registered a single conscious thought, his fingers were already preparing a sharp reply. The familiar rush flooded his system, the old certainty that a strong reaction would restore order and clarity. It had always felt natural, almost necessary. But that night, something subtle shifted. Marcus noticed the pressure rising inside him. Not the content of the message, not the irritation, but the speed. The feeling of being pulled toward an immediate response. For the first time, he recognized that the urgency came from inside, not from the situation itself. And when he paused, even for a few seconds, the heat of the moment began to fade. His perspective returned just enough for him to see that his instinct was not guidance, only momentum. This pause did not solve the entire relationship. It did not erase years of miscommunication or transform old patterns overnight. But it changed the direction of that particular moment. It prevented another unnecessary confrontation, another exchange they would both revisit with regret. And sometimes, progress begins not with a breakthrough, but with the absence of another mistake. Impulse is not a verdict. It is simply the earliest stage of emotion, appearing before clarity has the chance to form. When understood this way, it loses its authority. The presence of an immediate reaction no longer feels like proof that action is required. Instead, it becomes a sign that the mind is still reorganizing itself, still distinguishing between what is felt and what is true. Learning to recognize this difference is the first step toward any real emotional calm. The goal is not to eliminate impulse. That would mean eliminating emotion itself. The goal is to see it clearly enough that it no longer pulls the entire weight of a decision. The ability to separate impulse from action begins with something deceptively simple: noticing what happens inside the body before the mind assigns meaning to it. Most people believe they react to situations, but in reality, they react to the sensations that arise within them. Sensations that appear long before any understanding. A raised voice, a delayed response, an unexpected criticism. None of these events force a reaction. What creates urgency is the internal shift that follows, the subtle rise of discomfort that seeks release. This is why emotional control is not built in the moment of speaking, but in the moment just before it. When the pressure inside grows, the instinct is to move quickly, clarify, defend, correct, push back. Yet speed rarely brings wisdom. It simply carries the emotion forward with greater force, turning temporary tension into a direction rather than a signal. When decisions are made from this state, they often reflect the urgency of the feeling, not the truth of the situation. Small practices help interrupt this automatic pattern. The first is to pay attention to the physical markers of impulse. The breath that shortens, the posture that stiffens, the sudden inability to let a moment pass without intervening. These shifts are not flaws. They are early indicators that the emotional system is awakening. Naming the experience, silently acknowledging that an impulse is present, creates a slight distance between the person and the feeling. And in that distance, choice becomes possible. Waiting even 5 seconds may seem insignificant, yet those seconds act as a reset. They allow the emotional surge to settle just enough for clarity to re-enter. The situation does not change, but the interpretation does. What felt like urgency now feels more like information. What felt like a challenge becomes a moment to reassess. And what felt like a personal attack often softens into a misunderstanding rather than a threat. This small delay does not erase emotion. It stabilizes it. When people pause, they do not become less human or less passionate. They simply give themselves the chance to respond from the part of them that is steady rather than reactive. Over time, the pause becomes a natural extension of composure, a quiet strength that influences every conversation and decision. Others notice the difference even before it becomes fully conscious. The tone becomes calmer, the words more deliberate, the outcomes more aligned with long-term intention rather than momentary irritation. The challenge for the next 24 hours is straightforward. Catch the moment before the reaction forms. Notice how often the body tries to move faster than the mind. Notice how quickly the desire to respond rises, even when the situation does not demand it. Each moment of awareness is progress, whether or not the reaction changes immediately. Mastery begins with recognition, not perfection. Impulse will continue to appear. It is part of being human. But once it is visible, it no longer controls the narrative. It becomes a single piece of information among many, not the force that determines the next step. People who learn to see this moment gain an advantage that others spend years searching for. The ability to stay centered while everything around them asks for speed. Yet not all impulses arrive in the form of irritation or conflict. Some come disguised as explanation, the urge to justify a decision, to correct a misunderstanding, to defend oneself against opinions that never needed to be addressed. This, too, drains emotional strength quietly and consistently. The next chapter turns to this hidden habit and explores why constant explaining is one of the most subtle ways people lose their peace, often without realizing it. Chapter 2. Stop explaining yourself to everyone. There is a quieter impulse that drains emotional strength more consistently than anger or confrontation. It appears not as a sharp reaction, but as a subtle pressure to explain, defend, or justify every decision. It shows up when someone raises an eyebrow at a choice, questions a timeline, misinterprets a message, or assumes something that was never true. The instinct to clarify emerges so quickly that it feels like responsibility rather than a reflex. Explaining seems harmless at first. It feels polite, reasonable, even necessary to maintain harmony. Yet each explanation carries a cost. It requires energy to manage the impressions of others, to correct assumptions, to soften misunderstanding, and to close the gap between what someone thinks and what actually happened. When this habit becomes automatic, the cost becomes invisible. The need to justify turns into a quiet, constant withdrawal from the emotional budget that should be reserved for things that truly matter. Not every opinion deserves an answer. Not every misunderstanding needs repair. Many assumptions people form have little to do with reality and much to do with their own expectations, insecurities, or limited perspective. And when explanations are offered to minds that are not open, they rarely create clarity. They create dependence, a cycle where peace is traded for the temporary relief of being understood. David, a 49-year-old construction company owner, discovered this pattern through an unexpected route. A few negative comments about his business appeared online. At first, responding felt like simple professionalism, a way to correct misinformation and maintain reputation. But each reply led to another challenge, another opinion, another argument disguised as curiosity. What began as a single clarification turned into hours of engagement, each message pulling him further into a conversation he never needed to have. At the end of the month, he realized he had spent more time debating strangers than leading the company he built. This is the quiet danger of justification. It does not explode, it erodes. It redirects attention, drains focus, and hands emotional control to people who have no real stake in one's life. The need to explain grows stronger each time it is rewarded with temporary relief, until it becomes a reflex triggered by the slightest hint of disapproval. The truth is simple. Explaining is not always communication. Sometimes it is a response to discomfort. The discomfort of being misunderstood, judged, or seen through a lens that feels unfair. But misunderstanding is not always a threat. And responding to every one of them turns emotional strength into currency spent on moments that never deserved investment. The first step toward reclaiming that strength is recognizing how often the urge to justify arises and how little benefit it brings. The next part of this chapter explores how to break the pattern and why withholding explanations can become a powerful form of self-respect. Breaking the habit of constant justification begins with understanding what explanations actually achieve. Most of them do not change opinions. Most do not create connection. Most do not correct the misunderstanding they were meant to fix. Instead, they shift the emotional balance outward, placing someone else's assumptions above one's own clarity. When every question feels like a demand, and every raised tone feels like an obligation to respond, the center of control moves away from the person who should hold it. The impulse to explain often comes from a desire to restore order. When someone interprets a situation incorrectly, it feels natural to step in and correct it. When a decision is questioned, it feels responsible to justify it. When silence is misread, it feels necessary to clarify intentions. But beneath these reactions lies something far more subtle: the discomfort of being seen inaccurately. And in the effort to erase that discomfort, energy is spent where it brings no return. Not every misunderstanding is a threat. Many resolve themselves without intervention. Some reflect more about the person forming the opinion than the person receiving it. And some simply do not matter. When the need to be understood becomes a constant pursuit, the emotional budget shrinks under the weight of unnecessary explanations. Withholding explanations is not avoidance. It is a recalibration of priorities. It is the recognition that clarity does not require constant defense, and that one's decisions do not become more valid because someone else approves of them. Silence in these moments is not weakness. It is stability. It signals that validation is not the foundation on which one stands. A simple practice can help shift the pattern. When the urge to explain arises, pause and ask one question. Is this explanation necessary, or is it only an attempt to ease discomfort? If the situation will not change, if the person is not listening, if the misunderstanding is harmless, or if the explanation only feeds a cycle of overthinking, the answer is clear. The moment can pass without response. Over time, this restraint becomes a form of discipline. It protects attention from being scattered across conversations that do not require participation. It strengthens the ability to remain steady while others form their own interpretations. And it restores emotional energy that was being spent on maintaining an image rather than living one's life. The shift becomes noticeable. Decisions feel lighter because they no longer need to be presented for approval. Conversations feel cleaner because they are no longer shaped by the fear of being misread. The internal pace slows, leaving room for intention rather than urgency. And the silence that once felt uncomfortable begins to feel like a neutral space where clarity has room to grow. The challenge is simple. Spend the next day noticing every moment when the urge to justify appears, not to eliminate it, but to observe its frequency. Each observation is a reminder that control over explanation is control over energy. And as this awareness grows, the habit itself begins to loosen. Misunderstanding is a normal part of life. Trying to correct every one of them is not. The strength lies in knowing the difference and choosing where emotional effort belongs. The next chapter turns to another silent force that shapes reactions, learning to sit with internal tension instead of escaping it at the first sign of discomfort. Chapter 3. Learn to sit inside tension, not run from it. There is a particular kind of tension that appears before any important conversation, decision, or emotionally loaded moment. It rises quietly, tightening the stomach, shortening the breath, sharpening awareness in a way that feels uncomfortable enough to avoid. Most people treat this discomfort as a signal to move away, to distract themselves, to change the subject, to shut down a conversation, or to soften a truth. Avoidance becomes the default response, not because the moment is dangerous, but because the internal pressure feels unfamiliar. Yet tension is not a warning. It is a form of weight. And just like in a gym, progress begins not when the weight is removed, but when it is held with steadiness. Emotional discomfort often feels heavier than it is. The body reacts as if the situation will escalate, even when nothing threatens stability. A difficult question from a partner, a hesitant pause in a conversation with a colleague, a moment when someone asks for honesty. All of these create a low, steady tension that demands presence. But presence is exactly what many people struggle to maintain. The mind wants escape, believing that leaving the moment will ease the pressure faster than staying inside it. This habit of retreat builds a fragile kind of calm, one that depends on avoiding anything that might disturb it. But avoidance never resolves tension. It simply postpones it. The more a person steps away from discomfort, the more powerful it becomes. The moment they try to face it, the tension feels sharper, heavier, more intimidating. What could have been a brief emotional challenge grows into something that shapes behavior for years. Thomas, a 47-year-old financial director, once described this tension as the moment when truth rises to the surface. For years, he had avoided difficult conversations with his teenage son, choosing lighter topics whenever the air thickened with emotion. The discomfort seemed harmless to postpone. But one evening, after a strained exchange, he remained still instead of changing the subject or stepping away. The silence felt heavy, almost physical, but he stayed with it. In that pause, his son finally spoke openly, something he had not done in months. The conversation that followed did not erase their challenges, but it became the first moment of real connection in a long time. Staying with tension does not always lead to breakthroughs. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens. Sometimes the only thing gained is the knowledge that discomfort can be held without collapsing. But this alone is transformative. When a person learns they can remain inside pressure without rushing to escape, emotional stability naturally increases. The internal landscape becomes steadier, less reactive, less dependent on perfect circumstances. Tension becomes lighter when it is not feared, and the ability to stay with it becomes a quiet form of strength. Strength in emotional life is built the same way strength is built in physical training, through repeated exposure to manageable weight, not the kind that overwhelms, but the kind that challenges without breaking. Tension is that weight. Each moment of discomfort offers the opportunity to hold it for a little longer, to stay present long enough for clarity to emerge, and to show the nervous system that the feeling is safe to experience. The instinct to escape activates quickly. When the body senses emotional pressure, it begins searching for relief. A quick explanation, a shift in topic, a retreat into silence, or a distraction that promises immediate comfort. But comfort gained through avoidance has a short lifespan. It settles the moment, but leaves the deeper pattern untouched. The discomfort returns the next time a similar situation arises, sometimes stronger because it has never been met directly. Training begins with small, deliberate steps. One of the simplest exercises is a 3-minute practice of sitting with discomfort. When a tense feeling appears, frustration, defensiveness, hesitation, the task is not to suppress it or analyze it, but to observe it as a physical experience. Notice the breath, the posture, the places where tension gathers. Allow the emotion to exist without assigning meaning to it. In these few minutes, the body begins to learn that not every emotion requires movement. Stillness becomes a form of permission. Another useful practice is breathing into the tension rather than away from it. Deep, steady breaths signal to the nervous system that the environment is safe, even when the mind is uncertain. It does not eliminate the emotion, but it makes the internal space larger, giving the feeling room to unfold without overwhelming. This simple shift, from resisting to expanding, gradually rewires the automatic impulse to flee. A third tool is a brief discomfort journal. Writing a few sentences after a challenging moment creates a record of tension that was endured rather than avoided. Over time, patterns appear. The types of situations that trigger escape, the emotions that feel heaviest, the conversations that are repeatedly postponed. Seeing these patterns in writing reduces their power. They transform from vague internal threats into clear, manageable experiences. The more often these practices are repeated, the stronger the internal foundation becomes. Emotional stability is not built through perfect calm, but through the ability to remain steady when calm is temporarily gone. Each time discomfort is held instead of avoided, the threshold increases. What once felt overwhelming becomes tolerable. What once felt threatening becomes simply a moment of growth. This ability is especially valuable when tension appears in conversations that matter, with partners, children, colleagues, or anyone whose presence shapes the direction of one's life. Staying present during these moments allows truth to surface, misunderstandings to resolve, and connection to deepen. It also prevents the small discomforts of everyday life from accumulating into larger emotional debts. The challenge for the week is simple. Pause 3 times a day for 3 minutes when tension appears. Not to fix it, not to interpret it, but to stay. Consistency is what shifts the nervous system from reactivity to resilience. The next chapter explores another form of strength, the kind found not in speaking, but in silence. When used intentionally, silence becomes a boundary, a pause, and a source of clarity that protects both decisions and dignity. Chapter 4. The value of silence that protects you. Silence has a reputation it does not deserve. People often treat it as avoidance, weakness, or uncertainty. Yet silence is rarely empty. It is a space where emotion settles, where clarity rises, and where decisions take their true shape. In a world that pushes for immediate reactions and constant availability, choosing silence becomes an act of self-preservation. The pressure to answer quickly appears in many forms. A message arrives and waits like an open door that must be walked through immediately. A colleague pauses after a pointed remark, expecting a quick response. A partner asks a question that touches a sensitive place. In those moments, silence feels risky, almost provocative, as if delaying a reply will make the situation worse. But most damage comes not from waiting, but from speaking before understanding has caught up with feeling. Rushed words rarely reflect intention. They reflect tension. They mirror the state of the body rather than the clarity of the mind. When emotions rise, the urge to respond feels necessary, even responsible. Yet this urgency is usually nothing more than a nervous system trying to release pressure. Silence interrupts this pattern. It creates room for perspective to return, for the initial rush to settle, and for the next words to carry weight instead of noise. In negotiation rooms, in family conversations, in moments of conflict, silence often becomes the turning point. A person who does not rush to fill the space gains an advantage that cannot be manufactured through tone or volume. Silence signals steadiness. It shows that reactions are chosen, not pulled out by force. And because silence is so rare, it commands attention more effectively than raised voices ever could. Robert, a 45-year-old attorney, understood this unexpectedly during a difficult negotiation. The opposing side pushed aggressively, stacking arguments in rapid succession, hoping to provoke a quick concession. Instead of responding line by line, he remained quiet long enough for the room to shift. The pace slowed. The pressure softened. When he finally spoke, his words carried a calmness that set the tone for the rest of the discussion. The agreement that followed was not won by force, but by presence. Silence removes the urgency that distorts judgment. It allows a person to observe the situation instead of reacting to its velocity. It reveals what matters and what does not. Most importantly, silence protects from saying things that are untrue to intention. The comments that escalate conflict, the assumptions spoken too early, the sentences that create more work than they resolve. Choosing silence does not mean withholding forever. It simply means deciding when the moment is right to speak. Even a pause of an hour can transform the quality of a reply. The message no longer comes from the initial emotional surge, but from a grounded place that respects both the situation and oneself. The ability to delay a response is one of the quietest forms of strength. It replaces defensiveness with clarity, reactivity with intention, and noise with direction. The next portion of this chapter explores how silence becomes not only a pause, but a boundary, one that protects emotional balance and prevents others from pulling reactions that were never meant to be given. Silence becomes especially powerful when emotions run high and the expectation to respond grows stronger. The pressure often comes not from others, but from within. A sense that a delayed reply will be misunderstood, that hesitation will be taken as weakness, or that silence will make the situation worse. Yet most misunderstandings arise not from waiting, but from speaking before the full picture becomes clear. Choosing not to answer immediately gives the mind space to separate genuine intention from the noise of the moment. It reduces the influence of pride, fear, or defensiveness, allowing a measured response instead of a rushed one. Over time, silence becomes a form of emotional boundary. Not a wall that shuts people out, but a line that protects clarity and ensures that reactions do not come from instinct alone. A simple framework supports this shift. When tension rises, delaying the reply for even an hour allows the initial emotion to settle. Short, neutral phrases such as, "Let me think about this," create space without creating conflict. They signal presence without surrendering to urgency. In conversations where pressure escalates quickly, silence offers a stabilizing effect, slowing the pace long enough for respect and reason to re-enter the exchange. Intentional silence also prevents unnecessary escalation. Many arguments grow not from their content, but from the speed at which words collide. When one person slows down, the entire dynamic changes. The conversation shifts from reacting to understanding. People begin to listen differently. They mirror the steadiness they are shown. Silence, used well, reshapes the direction without forcing it. In personal relationships, silence can protect moments that would otherwise fracture. When disappointment or irritation rises, the instinct is often to respond instantly, to defend, to correct, to restore one's position. but a pause invites reflection. It creates a small distance between emotion and expression, allowing the deeper intention, care, respect, or honesty, to guide the next words. Many conflicts avoid unnecessary damage simply because someone chose to wait before speaking. Silence is not a refusal to engage. It is an act of choosing when engagement will lead to clarity rather than confusion. It is a reminder that being available does not mean being immediate, and that thoughtful communication often requires time. Even in situations where the expectation is rapid response, taking a moment to breathe and absorb the information strengthens both self-respect and the quality of the conversation. The challenge is consistent. Resist the urge to respond at the first pull of urgency. Allow silence to become part of how decisions and conversations unfold. In that stillness, reactions transform into choices, and communication becomes something shaped with intention rather than shaped by emotion. The next chapter turns to a different internal force, the voice of pride. While silence protects clarity on the outside, pride often disrupts clarity on the inside. Understanding how pride influences reactions becomes the next step in strengthening calm. Chapter 5. Recognize the voice of pride and don't let it speak for you. There is a particular tone that rises inside during moments of tension, quieter than anger, yet sharper than irritation. It appears when someone questions a decision, challenges authority, or speaks in a way that feels dismissive. This internal voice does not shout. It delivers its message with a cold certainty, insisting that something must be corrected immediately. That voice is pride, and it often takes control long before awareness catches up. Pride pretends to be protection. It presents itself as the guardian of dignity, the defender of status, the force that ensures a person is not overlooked or diminished. Yet most conflicts fueled by pride have little to do with genuine respect. They begin when the ego feels exposed, when being misunderstood seems dangerous, when appearing weak feels unacceptable, or when yielding even slightly feels like losing ground. The difficulty lies in how natural pride sounds. It speaks in familiar phrases. Don't let that slide. You can't walk away from this. Say something now or you'll regret it. Its urgency feels justified because it rarely announces itself as emotion. Instead, it disguises its push as logic, fairness, or responsibility. Many people follow it instinctively, believing they are standing up for themselves when, in reality, they are standing up for a momentary discomfort. Michael, a 51-year-old restaurant owner, experienced this repeatedly in conversations with his business partners. Whenever someone criticized a decision he made, even mildly, he felt a sharp internal pressure to answer immediately. The instinct to have the last word was not driven by clarity or strategy, but by a fear of appearing uncertain. When the tension inside rose, he would step in too soon, talk too long, and sometimes escalate issues that could have dissolved on their own. Only after several strained meetings did he begin noticing that the urge to speak came not from the importance of the situation, but from the need to protect an image he never questioned. Pride narrows perspective. It pushes attention toward winning moments instead of preserving relationships. It encourages reactions that feel strong in the moment but weaken trust, connection, and composure over time. The more a person listens to pride, the more fragile their calm becomes, because pride cannot tolerate even small moments of vulnerability. Recognizing the voice of pride is the first break in the pattern. Its presence is often marked by speed. The sudden need to prove something, the tightening that demands immediate correction, the impulse to add one more sentence even when silence would serve better. Pride speaks loudly when it fears exposure, and quietly when it fears losing relevance. Understanding these shifts makes it easier to notice when the ego attempts to take the lead. True strength does not require constant defense. It grows from the ability to stay steady when the ego feels threatened, to remain silent when pride urges speech, and to choose clarity over victory. The next part of this chapter explores a simple set of questions that exposes pride's motives and helps challenge its influence before it shapes a reaction. Once the voice of pride becomes recognizable, its influence weakens. It no longer blends seamlessly with thought. It becomes something separate, a reaction that rises quickly, asks for urgency, and disappears just as fast when not rewarded. But seeing pride is only the beginning. The next step is questioning it, because pride rarely survives honest examination. A simple internal check can shift the entire direction of a conversation. When the urge to respond sharply appears, pausing long enough to ask a few quiet questions creates distance. What exactly is being protected right now? What is the real cost of reacting? What outcome matters more, winning this moment or maintaining clarity? These questions are not meant to create doubt, but to expose the motivations pride prefers to hide. Often, the answer is disarming. Pride usually protects an image rather than a truth. It reacts to the possibility of looking weak, uninformed, or uncertain, not to an actual threat. When this becomes clear, the intensity of the emotion softens. The instinct to speak loses its power. A calmer, more deliberate response becomes possible. Or sometimes, no response at all. Choosing not to let pride speak does not mean surrendering. It means refusing to let temporary emotions shape permanent consequences. Conversations feel different when pride steps aside. There is more space for nuance, more room for listening, and more awareness of what matters in the long term. Exchanges that once escalated into arguments turn into discussions that resolve rather than fracture. This self-awareness builds a stronger sense of internal authority. A person who can remain steady when their ego feels threatened becomes harder to provoke, easier to trust, and clearer in their decisions. They gain a kind of quiet influence, not through dominance, but through consistency. Others sense the difference. They mirror the steadiness they observe, lowering their own defensiveness in return. Small practices reinforce this mindset. When pride begins to rise, delaying the next sentence even by a few seconds allows emotion to settle. When uncertainty or embarrassment appears, acknowledging the feeling internally prevents it from spilling outward. And when the desire to have the last word becomes overwhelming, stepping back often reveals that the moment does not need a final statement at all. Over time, the voice of pride loses its authority. It still appears, but it no longer dictates action. It becomes just another signal, something to notice, consider, and release. Strength begins to show not in forceful replies, but in the ability to choose silence, restraint, or a softer tone. The dignity pride tries to guard becomes more secure because it is no longer dependent on constant defense. The next chapter explores a related challenge: how to separate your emotional load from the emotional load of others. Pride may distort reactions, but absorbing emotions that are not yours distorts clarity. Learning to recognize which feelings belong to you and which do not becomes a crucial step in maintaining calm. Chapter 6. Don't make other people's emotions your responsibility. There is a quiet burden many people carry without ever noticing when it began. It appears in conversations that shift tone unexpectedly, in rooms where tension rises for reasons that have nothing to do with them, in exchanges where someone else's frustration or anxiety fills the space until it becomes difficult to breathe. Without realizing it, they start adjusting their behavior. softening their voice, or changing their decisions to manage emotions that are not their own. Most emotional exhaustion does not come from personal feelings. It comes from absorbing the feelings of others. Human beings are naturally receptive. They pick up disappointment in a partner's silence, irritation in a colleague's posture, or worry in a friend's tone. The problem emerges when these signals are treated as personal obligations. When someone feels responsible for fixing discomfort they did not create. Over time, this reflex becomes automatic. A person walks into a room, senses the emotional climate, and unconsciously begins carrying weight that does not belong to them. Jennifer, a 44-year-old CEO, lived with this pattern for years. Every time her team walked into a meeting, she could sense who was anxious, who was stressed, who was disengaged. She believed it was her job to stabilize the entire room. If someone appeared uneasy, she over-explained. If someone grew defensive, she softened her stance. If someone showed frustration, she took it as her failure. None of these reactions were intentional, yet they shaped her leadership and drained her energy. Her day felt heavy not because of her own emotions, but because she carried everyone else's. The weight of other people's feelings grows slowly but steadily. It creates fatigue that cannot be explained, irritability that appears without reason, and a sense of being overwhelmed even when life seems stable on the surface. The boundary between their emotion and my responsibility becomes blurred and eventually disappears. Recognizing this boundary is the foundation of emotional clarity. Every person carries their own history, expectations, fears, and stress. Their tone, expression, or mood reflects their internal state, not a request for emotional rescue. When people forget this, they start reacting to shadows, fixing what is not broken, defending what is not threatened, and interpreting neutral behavior as personal. The ability to stay centered begins with one realization: not every emotion you feel actually belongs to you. Understanding that not all emotions belong to you is only the beginning. The next step is learning to distinguish the subtle signals that reveal when someone else's inner world is spilling into your own. These signals often appear as sudden shifts in your mood, tension that was not there a moment ago, a heaviness that arrives without explanation, or an urge to fix a situation that was never yours to repair. These reactions do not originate within you. They are echoes of someone else's internal storm. Emotional boundaries are not walls. They do not require withdrawal or distance. They are simply the recognition that every person must carry the weight of their own feelings. When boundaries are clear, compassion becomes cleaner. Decisions become simpler. Interactions become lighter because they are no longer shaped by invisible emotional debts. Presence remains, but responsibility shifts back to its rightful place. One of the most effective ways to rebuild this boundary is through a moment of internal identification. When a strong feeling rises, pausing long enough to ask, "Is this mine?" creates separation. If the emotion appears suddenly, without context, or only in the presence of a specific person, it often belongs to them. This awareness prevents the automatic reflex to soothe, correct, or adjust yourself to ease their discomfort. Another quiet but powerful practice is the visualization of a personal boundary. Not a barrier, but a line of clarity. Imagining this boundary as a space where emotions can be observed without being absorbed changes the way interactions unfold. The room may still carry tension, but it does not enter the core of your being. You stay grounded while others move through their own processes. There is also strength in returning emotions to their rightful owner. Silently, without confrontation. When someone's frustration, anxiety, or disappointment begins to influence your behavior, gently reminding yourself this is theirs restores balance. It allows you to respond with steadiness rather than react with guilt or defensiveness. The situation remains the same, but your place within it changes. You stop carrying weight that was never meant for you. Over time, this practice transforms relationships. Conversations become more honest because they are no longer shaped by fear of triggering someone else's feelings. Decisions become more aligned with personal values rather than emotional pressure. Leadership becomes more consistent because it is not swayed by the momentary currents of the room. Even family dynamics soften when responsibility is distributed back to each individual instead of being absorbed by one. Emotional clarity is not built by shutting out others. It is built by refusing to lose yourself inside their storms. Allowing people to carry their own emotions is an act of respect for them and for yourself. It honors the truth that every person is responsible for the way they feel, and that absorbing their emotional load does not bring peace. It only transfers conflict. Chapter 7. When leaving is stronger than responding. There are moments when a situation becomes so saturated with noise, tension, or unspoken expectations that responding no longer serves any purpose. Words begin to lose precision. The atmosphere thickens. The other person becomes less interested in understanding and more invested in venting, winning, or proving a point. In these moments, staying engaged drains clarity and invites conflict that offers no meaningful outcome. Walking away is not retreat, it is wisdom. Many people remain in conversations long after they should have stepped out. They feel obligated to fix the moment, to defend themselves, to explain something one more time, or to hold the emotional weight until the other person settles. But staying in a room full of escalating noise does not bring resolution. It only deepens the strain and reinforces patterns that harm everyone involved. Leaving becomes necessary, not when emotions rise, but when the situation stops progressing. A room can be loud without being productive. A conversation can be intense without being meaningful. The ability to recognize this limit marks the difference between those who exhaust themselves trying to manage every interaction and those who preserve their energy for moments that matter. Anna, a 46-year-old clinic owner, learned this distinction through difficult experience. For years, she remained in a partnership that drained her confidence and obscured her direction. Meetings turned into arguments, discussions into power struggles, small concerns into endless debates. She stayed because she believed endurance was strength. She believed that patience, repeated explanations, and tolerance would eventually transform the dynamic. Instead, the dynamic consumed her momentum. Only when she stepped away, quietly, decisively, did she regain the clarity she had been missing. The move was not an escape. It was a reclamation. Leaving does not always mean ending a relationship or abandoning responsibility. Sometimes it means stepping out of a heated conversation to let emotions settle. Sometimes it means ending a message thread that has shifted into provocation rather than communication. Sometimes it means excusing yourself from a meeting that has lost direction. The action is simple. The impact is profound. Stepping away prevents unnecessary damage and protects the stability required to make thoughtful decisions. The hesitation to leave often comes from fear. Fear of appearing weak, fear of being misunderstood, fear of making the situation worse. But the strongest moments in life are rarely the loudest. Strength often shows through restraint, through the willingness to remove energy from a situation that cannot benefit from it. Leaving is a choice made not from anger, but from clarity. It is the acknowledgement that presence already gave everything it could, and that the next step requires distance. When done with intention, leaving becomes one of the most powerful tools for emotional preservation. Stepping out of a draining situation requires more than awareness. It requires permission, the internal kind that does not wait for approval. Many people stay longer than necessary because they feel responsible for the emotions in the room, or because they fear the judgment that might follow. Yet the act of leaving, when done with intention, communicates something essential: that stability is more important than control, and that clarity is more valuable than being right. Leaving well is an art. It does not involve dramatic exits, sharp words, or symbolic gestures. It is quiet, measured, and deliberate. It reflects the understanding that emotional energy is finite and should not be spent where it produces no growth. When someone steps away calmly, without anger or justification, the moment loses its power over them. The situation continues, but the emotional grip dissolves. A key part of this art is leaving without explanation. Many people feel compelled to justify why they need space, hoping to avoid misunderstanding. But explanations often pull them back into the very dynamic they are trying to exit. A simple statement, or even a silent pause, can do more to de-escalate than any attempt to clarify. Space, once created, speaks for itself. Another element of leaving well is releasing guilt. Guilt convinces people that endurance is noble, that staying in discomfort proves strength or loyalty. But real strength lies in knowing when presence is no longer productive. Guilt drains authority. Clarity restores it. When someone steps away without carrying emotional residue, they regain the mental space required to think, choose, and act with intention. Leaving with dignity preserves relationships rather than damaging them. A calm exit sends a message that the conversation matters, but that it must continue under better conditions. It protects both sides from saying things driven by heat rather than truth. Some conflicts resolve only because one person chose silence, distance, and reflection, instead of matching the intensity of the moment. Over time, the ability to walk away becomes a stabilizing force. It prevents burnout. It reduces unnecessary friction. It teaches others how you expect to be treated and how you treat yourself. When leaving is used thoughtfully, it creates emotional boundaries strong enough to withstand provocation and clear enough to guide future interactions. Life contains rooms that cannot be fixed, only exited. Conversations that cannot be repaired, only paused. Dynamics that cannot be reshaped from within, only changed through distance. Recognizing these moments is not avoidance. It is intelligence. And choosing to leave is not defeat. It is a decision to invest energy where it can create something better. The next chapter turns to situations where leaving is not possible. Moments when responsibilities, roles, or circumstances require staying present. In those moments, the strongest asset becomes composure, the ability to remain steady even when the room does not allow escape. Chapter 8. Calm is the new status. There comes a point in life when loudness stops signaling strength. The years that once rewarded intensity, sharp reactions, and fast decisions begin to demand something different. Influence shifts from volume to presence. Respect shifts from force to steadiness. The people who stand out are no longer the ones who push the hardest, but the ones who remain clear when everyone else loses direction. Calm becomes a form of status, not the absence of emotion, but the ability to guide emotion instead of being guided by it. In midlife, the stakes grow higher. Careers reach defining chapters, families depend on stability, and decisions carry consequences that echo far into the future. This is the season when reactivity becomes costly. A single impulsive message can damage trust. A moment of irritation can derail a conversation that mattered. A rushed conclusion can set off a chain of errors that takes years to unwind. Those who thrive are not the ones who avoid pressure, but the ones who refuse to let pressure choose their behavior. Teams, relationships, and environments respond differently to someone who stays composed under strain. Calm individuals draw clarity out of others. Their steadiness encourages better solutions because it creates room for thinking instead of panic. Their presence lowers the emotional temperature of a room. People rely on them not because they demand authority, but because they embody it. This calm is not passive. It is intentional and practiced. It appears in the moments when others expect a sharp reaction, but receive a grounded one instead. It reveals itself in the ability to pause without losing momentum, to listen without defending, to evaluate without being swept into the emotional tide of the situation. Warren Buffett is often cited for this quality, not because he avoids risk or discomfort, but because he remains unmoved by the noise that influences everyone else. His calm is not detachment. It is clarity. The clarity that comes from understanding that emotionally driven decisions rarely lead to long-term success. His influence is rooted not in intensity, but in the quiet authority of someone who chooses his timing rather than letting circumstances force it. Calm communicates confidence more effectively than declarations or explanations. It signals a grounded inner state, a trust in one's judgment, and an understanding that urgency is not the same as importance. In midlife, this becomes a rare and powerful advantage, one that transforms how people lead, decide, and connect. Calm does not appear by accident. It is strengthened through consistent choices that anchor the mind before the demands of the day begin. Small rituals practiced in the morning shape the emotional baseline from which decisions, conversations, and reactions unfold. Even a few minutes of intentional stillness can influence the entire rhythm of the day. One of the most effective practices is starting the morning without immediate exposure to external noise. The moment a phone screen lights up, the mind shifts into reaction mode, processing messages, absorbing concerns, responding to expectations. Beginning the day with 10 quiet minutes before touching any device creates a buffer that protects clarity. It allows space for breathing, reflection, or simple presence before the world begins asking for attention. Another grounding ritual is reading a single page of something meaningful. Not information to consume, but perspective to carry. A brief passage can reset the internal lens, reminding the mind that reactions do not need to mirror circumstances. This small act shapes the emotional posture for the hours ahead, offering calm not as a mood, but as a deliberate stance. Short meditative practices also play a role. Even 2 or 3 minutes of focused breathing shift the nervous system out of urgency and into steadiness. These minutes teach the mind to return to a centered state throughout the day, especially when pressure rises. Calm becomes not an aspiration, but a familiar internal place that can be reached quickly and quietly. The people who build these rituals often notice a subtle transformation. External challenges remain, but the internal response changes. Stressful conversations feel less personal. Unexpected problems feel less disruptive. Decisions feel less rushed. Calm becomes a kind of internal architecture, something stable enough to rely on when circumstances fluctuate. This stability radiates outward. Colleagues sense it and adjust their approach. Family members respond to it with greater ease. Difficult situations soften in its presence. Calm becomes influence, not because it dominates, but because it steadies everything around it. In midlife, this influence carries particular weight. Experience provides knowledge, but Calm provides access to that knowledge in moments when it matters most. It turns pressure into clarity. It turns urgency into direction. It becomes the difference between reacting and leading. Cultivating calm is not about removing emotion. It is about creating enough internal space for emotion to move through without taking control. This space transforms difficult days into manageable ones and turns challenges into decisions rather than crises. Chapter 9. The Daily Protocol for Calm. A steady life is not built from grand gestures. It grows from small, consistent actions that realign the mind before the day has the chance to pull it off course. Calm does not appear spontaneously. It is trained through repetition. The purpose of a daily protocol is not to create perfection, but to create rhythm. A few predictable moments that give structure to everything else. Most people begin their morning already behind. The mind wakes up to alerts, unfinished conversations, responsibilities waiting in silent lists. Before the first step out of bed, attention is already scattered. The day becomes a reaction, not a choice. A protocol changes this pattern by establishing a starting point that is grounded rather than chaotic. The morning segment of the protocol is simple but powerful. It begins with a brief scan for impulses, not the dramatic ones, but the small internal pulls that shape the tone of the day. A lingering irritation, an unresolved thought, a subtle defensiveness. Noticing these micro-reactions prevents them from dictating the hours ahead. Awareness replaces automatic movement. Space replaces urgency. From there, a quiet pause anchors the mind. Just 5 minutes of intentional stillness, not meditation in its formal sense, but a moment of settling, gives the nervous system a chance to reset. This pause communicates something essential. The day will begin on your terms, not on the terms of incoming demands. As the morning unfolds, decisions become clearer. The protocol creates a buffer between emotion and action, between pressure and response. Even small challenges feel different when the mind begins from a place of order. Calm is no longer something to pursue throughout the day. It becomes the foundation on which the day rests. The midday portion of the protocol is equally important. It focuses on one practice: pausing before every significant response. Not long enough to interrupt work, but long enough to prevent impulse from leading. A single breath, a brief internal question, a moment to check whether the emotion behind the reply is accurate or simply fast. This habit transforms communication. It reduces misunderstandings, prevents escalation, and reinforces emotional authority. In the evening, the final step completes the cycle. A short reflection, 5 minutes, no more, brings awareness to how the day unfolded. What moments sparked impulse? Which interactions required restraint? Where did tension appear and how was it handled? This reflection is not for judgment, but for clarity. Patterns become visible. Progress becomes measurable. And tomorrow becomes easier because today was examined. These 3 segments, morning, midday, and evening, form the structure of a life lived with intention. Each part supports the others. Each reduces emotional friction. Each strengthens the ability to remain centered, even when the outside world pulls in every direction. A protocol becomes powerful only when it becomes repeatable. The goal is not to create a perfect day, but to create a consistent rhythm the mind can rely on. Repetition turns awareness into instinct. It makes calm less dependent on circumstances and more rooted in habit. A single day of discipline can feel transformative, but a week of discipline begins to change the way the nervous system responds to life. The 7-day challenge is simple by design. Each day requires only a few minutes, yet those minutes accumulate into a noticeable shift. The challenge does not demand avoiding stress or eliminating conflict. It asks only for presence, the ability to see moments clearly instead of being pulled into them unconsciously. Day 1 focuses on impulse, noticing the very first spark before a reaction forms. Not correcting it, not suppressing it, simply recognizing it. This awareness sets the foundation for everything that follows. When the mind sees the impulse, it gains the ability to choose. Day 2 strengthens the pause. Before answering messages, responding to questions, or stepping into difficult conversations, taking a few seconds creates a buffer that protects clarity. This pause becomes the quiet doorway through which the entire day passes. Day 3 brings attention to tension, staying with discomfort without rushing to escape it. Even 30 seconds of deliberate presence can shift how the body interprets stress. The nervous system learns that not every rise in emotion is a threat. Day 4 practices silence, not avoidance, but intentional space. Delayed responses, neutral phrases, and moments of stillness reveal how often clarity emerges when noise is allowed to settle. Day 5 focuses on pride's voice, recognizing when it tries to shape reactions. Identifying this voice weakens its influence and allows decisions to come from intention rather than ego. Day 6 centers on emotional boundaries, noticing which feelings belong to you and which do not. Returning responsibility to its rightful place lightens the internal load. Day 7 integrates all of it. The goal is not perfection, but continuity. A day lived with deliberate awareness, measured responses, and steady presence. By the end of the week, something subtle shifts. Reactions slow, choices widen. The internal space between emotion and action grows larger. The body feels less pulled, the mind feels less scattered, and calm begins to feel less like an effort and more like a natural state. This protocol is not the conclusion of a journey. It is the beginning of one. The skills developed across the entire book, pausing, noticing, breathing, waiting, separating, stepping away, become woven into the rhythm of everyday life. And as they do, calm evolves from a practice into a defining quality. Conclusion: the beginning of a different life. Reaching the end of this book does not mean reaching the end of the work. Calm is not a talent someone is born with or a trait reserved for a select few. It is a practice, one strengthened each time an impulse is noticed, each time a pause is chosen, each time a difficult moment is met with steadiness instead of speed. Every chapter has offered a different doorway into that practice, and each doorway leads back to the same truth. Emotional control is built through clarity, not force. The 9 skills outlined throughout these pages form a framework that can support any life, no matter the pressures, responsibilities, or circumstances. The ability to recognize an impulse prevents mistakes before they form. The willingness to stop justifying protects emotional energy. The strength to sit with tension builds resilience. Silence adds gravity to words. Understanding pride guards against unnecessary conflict. Emotional boundaries keep the internal world clean. Leaving when necessary preserves dignity. Calm, when cultivated, becomes influence. And a daily protocol turns all of these skills into something steady enough to rely on. Change rarely arrives in dramatic moments. It grows quietly, through small choices repeated over time. The shift becomes visible only when a familiar situation no longer pulls the same reaction, when tension no longer spirals into urgency, when conversations no longer feel like battles to win. Calm becomes the default, not because life becomes easier, but because the inner world becomes stronger. The final challenge is simple. Dedicate the next 30 days to practicing one skill from this book each day. Not perfectly, not rigidly, consistently. Choose an impulse to observe. Choose a conversation to pause before answering. Choose a moment of tension to stay present with. Choose a situation to leave with dignity. Choose a boundary to hold. These small daily acts accumulate, reshaping patterns that were once automatic. A month is enough to create momentum, enough to see progress, enough to feel the nervous system respond to new habits. And once momentum begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to old ways of reacting. Calm is not an endpoint. It is a way of moving through the world with intention, a way of making decisions that reflect direction rather than emotion, a way of living that protects energy, strengthens relationships, and builds a life that is not easily shaken. This book ends here. The practice begins now.